Hi guys, today I'm going to show you a project I'm really excited about. I love room boxes, but I have a little issue with them. They usually only have walls on 2 or at most 3 sides, which makes sense. You need an open side to see what's in the room, but it also means having 2 sides that are just a little bit empty. So I wondered, why not make a room box with 4 walls that can be removed and put back in place whenever I want to. I don't know how healthy it is for me to be so excited about this project, but if you're as weirdly obsessed with miniatures as I am, keep watching to find out how I made it. Firstly, let's talk supplies. To make the walls of this room box, we'll need cardstock in a fairly large format and some kind of wood sticks like these ones. Optionally, you can also use wood or MDF panels. The first thing we want to do is cut the basic shape of our room's 4 walls into the cardstock. If you're building this room for Barbie dolls, I suggest making the walls at least 40 to 45 centimeters tall. We're gonna have to cut 2 identical cardstock parts for each wall. At this stage, you can already cut out the holes in the walls where you want to place windows or doors. As you can see, my room box has 1 wall with a window, 1 with a door, and 2 plain ones. For these last 2, I'm gonna use an MDF panel, and if you don't have it, don't worry, I'll show you how to make a wall without it in a moment. Glue one of the cardstock parts to the panel, cut it to size, then flip it over and glue the other cardstock layer on the opposite side of the panel. Now, these next 2 walls are a little more complicated to cut, so I ditched the MDF panel and I used these wood sticks instead. Lay all the sticks in one direction, trying to space them evenly. Ideally, there shouldn't be more than 8 centimeters between each row. Glue all the sticks to the cardstock base like this. Once you've laid all the sticks in one direction, measure the gap between each row and cut a bunch of sticks to this length. Finally, attach these shorter sticks to the cardstock base. Make sure you frame the window and door holes with the sticks as well. This is what you should end up with, and I have to say I was surprised to see how sturdy the structure is. I actually think you could get away with stopping right here and the walls would be sturdy enough. However, just to be sure, I decided to go the extra step and fill each space between the wood sticks with a piece of corrugated cardboard from an old box. At this point, you can cover the top part of this inner structure with the other cardstock layer, like this. I decided to use magnets to lock the movable walls in place. The best kind of magnet would be something like this, but I didn't have anything similar, so I used these tiny round magnets. Take the front wall of your room box and glue the magnets to its left and right edges. Then cut a few strips of cardstock. I used cardstock from old packagings. Glue these strips to the edge of the wall to fill the gap between each magnet. Repeat this step for the back wall, but place the magnets only on the right side. Now, this is where I kind of messed up, because for the opposite walls, I used a stapler, punched a few loose staples, and glued them to the edge of the wall. That's what I usually do when working with magnets, but in this case, I realized that staples just didn't provide enough grip to keep the magnets and therefore the walls locked in place. So eventually I decided to use magnets on the opposite walls as well. To do that, I found that the best way is to take the wall with the magnets already glued in place, put another layer of magnets on top of the first one, paint them with just a little bit of acrylic paint, and then immediately press the wall against the opposite one, like this. This way you get a perfect trace of where you need to glue the magnets on the opposite wall. Now scrape the cardstock off of these areas so that the magnets won't be sticking out, and then glue them in place. If you don't have magnets, you can skip this step and just use either double-sided tape or a poster putty to connect the walls. Now that the base structure of our walls is done, we can paint them, and I used acrylic gesso for this because it has this nice plaster-like texture and it conceals that the walls are essentially just paper. And don't forget to paint the sides of the walls as well. I wanted to have bricks on the outside walls of my room box, so I designed and cut a brick stencil, which honestly took longer than I expected, and I used it with gesso to get this 3D bricks effect. And then I painted the walls with a mixture of red and brown acrylic. Now we can begin to add details to our room box walls. First, we can make a window. I already made a sliding window a while back using craft sticks, and you can see how I made it here. But this time I wanted to use paper, so here's what I did. Firstly, I cut these two frames into cardstock and attached them together. Then I glued them to the exterior part of the wall. And as you can see, there's a little extra rim that's visible from the opposite side of the wall. Then I cut 4 smaller frames. These frames should be tall enough to fit into the window without getting stuck, and their length should be just a little more than half of the window's length. For the window's glass panels, I used clear plastic from old packagings. I glued 2 of the frames on the plastic, cut it to size, and glued the remaining frames on the opposite side of the plastic panel. Then I glued one of these panels to the frame on the wall. Next, I cut 2 thin strips of cardstock and glued them to the frame right next to the plastic panel, like this. At this point, I took a square craft pick, painted it black, and cut it to a length of approximately 2 centimeters. I glued these pieces to the remaining panel to make a handle. I placed this panel over the first one, then I cut this frame into cardstock and folded its sides like this. Then I glued the 4 little tabs to the wall, and I found that this is much easier if you cut the frame in half. Finally, I cut 2 more frames and glued them to the interior side of the wall. And I'll upload a reference template for the window at the end of the video in case you need it. Next, we can make a door, and for starters, let's build the door frame. I used mat board for this, but balsa wood or cardstock will also work. Measure the length of the sides of the hole in the wall, then cut 2 strips of mat board for each side, like this. Repeat the same steps for the inner part of the frame, making sure to measure the thickness of the wall as well. In order to make a working door, we're gonna need tiny hinges like these. If you don't have them, you can either go for a simpler pivot mechanism, which you can see in many of my previous videos like this one, or you can even make your own hinges using paper. And you can find a lot of tutorials about this here on YouTube. Now, if you are using hinges, you'll have to cut out a little slot for them in the inner part of the door frame. I also cut out a small rectangle in the opposite side of the frame where we'll place the strike plate. At this point, you should have all these parts. Glue them around the hole in the wall like this. Then paint the door frame with acrylic gesso, coat it with a clear glossy varnish, and finally glue the hinges in place. Color the little rectangle on the opposite side with black paint. Then cut a small plate into metallic paper and attach it to the door frame. Alternatively, you can simply paint the plate with acrylics. Now we can start working on the door itself. Measure the width and length of the door's aperture, then cut a cardstock template to this size and make sure it fits. To build the structure of the door, I use these flat barbecue skewers, but craft sticks will work just fine, as long as you layer them 2 at a time. Simply place the skewers or craft sticks on the cardstock template to measure the right length and width, then cut them, and finally glue them over the template. Now measure the gaps between each skewer and cut a few pieces of cardstock to this size. I decided to make mine about half a centimeter smaller than the space between the skewers to achieve a more three-dimensional look. Glue these pieces of cardstock 3 or 4 at a time until they are about as thick as the skewer, then glue them to the door. This will make the structure a lot sturdier. At this point, we can color our door with acrylic gesso, and I finished it off with some clear gloss varnish. Now, place the door over the wall and glue a little latch bolt and faceplate cut out of metallic paper at the same height as the strike plate. Next, we can make the door's handle. There are several ways to make one. The simplest is to take a square craft pick, cut it into 2 parts, use a nail file to give them a more rounded shape, and finally attach them together like this. You can also use a toothpick and a coffee stirrer, or if you want a knob instead of handle, you can use a toothpick and a round bead, as I showed you in my miniature bookcase tutorial. I went a different way and decided to design my handles on my laptop, and then I 3D printed them, because I'm spoiled. You also need to make a keyhole cover and a rosette for the handle. I 3D printed mine, but you can easily make them using metallic cardstock. Glue the keyhole cover to the side of the door approximately at the same height as the faceplate. I decided to draw a small black rectangle on the door to give the illusion of a hole actually being there, if that makes sense. Glue the rosette right above the keyhole, like this. And of course, you'll have to repeat this step for both sides of the door. Now, if you want to make a working handle, you'll need to drill a hole into the handle as well as into the door. Then use an eye pin or a needle and glue it to one of the handles. Slide the high pin into the hole in the door, cut away the excess part, then glue the second handle in place. The handle should rotate quite easily. Now we can attach the door to the hinges. When all the walls are ready, we can begin working on the floor of our little room box. Cut a cardstock rectangle with the size of your room. I actually glued together 3 layers of cardstock to make the floor a little bit sturdier. Now, my room box is going to host a bathroom, so I opted for a tile floor. But if you want to see how to make a wooden floor using paper, just check out this video. I tested several ways to make the tiles, and in the end, my favorite method was to use cardstock, paint it with diluted acrylic, and then cover it with clear tape to get that nice shiny finish. I cut a bunch of tiles and simply attached them to the cardstock base using double-sided tape. Now that all the parts of our room box are ready, we can finally assemble them. Glue the back wall to the left side wall. Then attach these walls to the floor. And that's it! The 2 remaining walls can be added or removed according to need. As promised, here's the link to the reference template to help you make a working sliding window for your room box, and I suggest you watch this video next to find out how to make working Roman blinds as well. And this is all for today's video. Until next time, bye!